Hey folks, my name is Kyle Reaume. I am a filmmaker as well as an instructor at Toronto Film School. Welcome to my channel where I discuss movies and TV shows with a mixed legacy. Now, what do I mean when I say that mixed legacy? I love exploring the idea of film franchises that didn't have all good films or didn't have all bad films. You know, I think it's a lot more fascinating to look at franchises where some of the entries are amazing, some of the entries are unforgivably terrible, and everything in between. I mean, that's what's more interesting to talk about, right? It's not nearly as fun to talk about a franchise with an ironclad legacy. Actually, what franchise does have an ironclad legacy? How to Train Your Dragon. We can't all be How to Train Your Dragon. It's fascinating to explore what happened with these franchises and sort of try to pinpoint where this franchise sort of veered off course. With some franchises, it's more obvious. With some franchises, it's a little more debatable. I also love watching past the point in a franchise where most people have stopped. And then I like to report on that. If you are into film franchises where you didn't really finish the series, but you're interested to find out what happened, but you don't want to waste your time watching like 9 hours of all of those franchises, this is the right place. Today we are going to be talking about a YA dystopian franchise that essentially killed the profitability of dystopian YA franchises. Today's topic is about The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is a film franchise, of course, based on the popular novels by Suzanne Collins. The first feature, The Hunger Games, was released in 2012, with The Hunger Games catching fire just 1 year later in 2013. Mockingjay Part 1 was released in 2014, and finally Mockingjay Part 2, 2015. One thing I immediately want to draw your attention to is that all 4 of these films were subsequent. 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. So during this 4-year period, there was a Hunger Games every year. That may have oversaturated the market in and of itself. But then again, Harry Potter put out one every year, almost every time, and that did work out really well for them. However, the Hunger Games franchise never had the kind of audience that something like Harry Potter did. Chances are you probably hadn't heard of the Hunger Games books until that first movie came out. I am no exception to this. I had never heard of it, and then I went and I saw the first movie, and I did read the books afterwards. The first movie convinced me to read the books. I really enjoyed the first book. I loved the second book, and didn't love the third book. But I'm jumping ahead. So first, let's talk about each of these films. The Hunger Games 2012. This is the film that essentially rocket launched Jennifer Lawrence into that A-tier status. It's true at this point she had already been nominated for an Oscar for Winter's Bone. However, her starring in the Hunger Games franchise officially solidified her as an A-tier star who can lead a franchise. The film is also fleshed out with a pretty stellar cast. We've got people like Woody Harrelson, Elizabeth Banks, Donald Sutherland as President Snow. He's a pretty good antagonist in this film, although I will say, and I still do feel this way, from the very first time that I watched it, I always thought the idea of President Snow was just that. He was more of an idea rather than like a Voldemort-like antagonist that we always knew our character would come face to face with. And that is true, especially of the first movie, where they never come face to face at all, and they don't even directly communicate. It's pretty clear in this movie that, if anything, the system or the status quo is meant to be more of the enemy. Yes, there's definitely explicit blame on people in the capitals, particularly people like President Snow who run the games, but the fault is ultimately of the entire system, not just that individual. The series does address this, albeit in a bit of a wishy-washy way later on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Overall, I think this film is really solid. I actually enjoyed it more when I watched it for the second time. And here's what happened. Maybe this happened to you too. The film came out in 2012, it had a theatrical release, and the reviews were fairly positive. However, there is one aspect of the film that was a point of contention, and that subject was the cinematography. Cinematography refers to the shape and form of how a film is captured, including things like the cameras that they use, the lenses, camera style. Is it smooth? Is it handheld? When this film was released in theaters, a lot of people, myself included, had some feelings about the cinematography because of the handheld. Now, there's nothing wrong with handheld cinematography. I, point in fact, love it. For my film Shelley, we made it essentially all handheld. I wanted it to feel very voyeuristic. I think that initial approach with the first Hunger Games movie was a good idea, but there is a real question to be made here about making movies for a theatrical presentation and making movies for a home distribution viewing. Because here's the thing. This film is a lot of handheld. I think it's almost all handheld. While it does really convey this sort of sense of urgency and reality, that does also sort of add to the grittiness. A lot of people found it nauseating. Watching it on a big screen, no matter where you are in the theaters, did feel disorienting. It was something a lot of people were talking about. Some people loved it, some people hated it, some people didn't notice it. I really felt that the camera was too shaky sometimes. However, watching this at home, I completely disagree. I think the cinematography is great. I think the handheld style is beautiful. Watching it on something like a 30 or a 40-inch screen as compared to a 40, 50-foot screen, it really, really works for the home video viewing. Watching this on your TV, watching this on your iPad, hell, watching this on your phone, it looks really good. The big thing that I think about with this film is the debate of theatrical release versus home release. When we as filmmakers make feature films, our idea is to screen it in a theater, but then we know that it's going to end up on home media for the rest of its life. So the question becomes, do we make a film for theatrical presentation or do we make a film for home video presentation? Do we try to do it for both? Do we just try to do it for the one? I don't know. Maybe this whole shaky cam thing is something that people don't necessarily talk about anymore because the film has been out of theaters for like 9 years. I don't have an issue with it. I think Jennifer Lawrence is pretty compelling in this. I think overall the acting in this film is really good. I also think it's pretty well directed. Suzanne Collins did a very good job adapting her own script. She wrote the screenplay, which is something that I absolutely love when authors do. Just like when the author of Holes wrote the screenplay, because I think it turned into a beautiful film. And I think we have a similar situation here. This one is really, really accurate to the first book. Suzanne Collins clearly did a lot of research on survival skills and hunting and foraging because the books go into a lot of detail of how Katniss uses this to survive. This film was a little bit of a sleeper hit. The thing you need to understand is that it was kind of a risky IP, okay? The books were popular, but they were nothing on the scale of something like Harry Potter or Twilight, which both went on to celebrate huge franchise releases. They're also tied into this because they both did something that this film did with its franchise too, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The film was made for a fairly modest budget of $78 million. It was also a risky IP for Lionsgate. For those who aren't familiar, Lionsgate has had some financial difficulties for the last several decades. They have really struggled with owning popular and well-earning franchises. So they made the first Hunger Games with a modest budget of $78 million, and it grossed almost $700 million. So they made it for under $80 million, and it made almost $700 million. It outperformed their modest expectations, and again, it really jettisoned Jennifer Lawrence into this A+ tier. Now, of course, I can't talk about the Hunger Games without talking about the Battle Royale comparison. I don't have a lot to say on this one, so I did go and watch Battle Royale, and here's what I will say. Just because two pieces of intellectual property have similar story themes or similar story ideas does not mean that one is necessarily infringing on the other. People love to make the comparison between Pocahontas and Avatar, and yes, ideas and themes in it are similar, but the stories and the way that they're executed are wildly, incomparably different. Battle Royale is a film about Japanese school children who are being punished by adults who feel that these misbehaving children need serious consequences to their shenanigans. Hunger Games is a dystopian future where the poor children are selected from a pool to compete and fight to the death for the entertainment of the well-to-do, rich, and elite in District 1. It's not really the same. The big comparison that people make here is they're both films about children in tournaments having to kill each other. Neither of these intellectual properties is the first to do it, but I understand the comparison. The film was a critical success, earning an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics praising the acting, the tone, as well as the direction. All things I definitely agree with. Catching Fire. So Catching Fire is the follow-up to the first film, and I have to say, just gotta put this out there, I love this film. I love this film. I was kind of blown away by it when I saw it in theaters. I really liked the first film. I will also say that my feelings about the first film have actually warmed up in the almost decade since its release. So for me, I was very impressed with Catching Fire because I truly felt, and I still do feel this way, that it just outperformed the first film in every way. This film is firing on all cylinders. It is a much more complex version of the dystopian future. We get to see more of the capital. We get to see a different version of the games. We get to learn more about the victors, which I find absolutely fascinating. The interaction between all the victors is honestly gold. It's some of the best dialogue interactions we get across the whole series. Jenna Malone comes in, just shanks every scene. She steals every scene that she's in. She's so good.
Well, yes, I'm angry. You know, I'm getting totally screwed over here.
I'm a big Jenna Malone fan. I always feel like she's been a little bit slept on as an actor. So for her to be in this major Hollywood franchise is very, very exciting. However, she got really shafted in later ones. Everything about this film is bigger. For one, the budget was bigger. Compared to the modest $70-something million of the first one, this one had a budget of somewhere between 130 and 140. So they were definitely investing more time, more energy, more budget, and more advertising into this one. Also, kind of weird, kind of gross side note to this. Chris Martin doing the song for this film is how he and Jennifer Lawrence met, and they briefly dated. This was right off the heels of Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow separating. Clearly, this man, I mean, you know, sometimes when you're that age, you're in your 40s and you're recently single, maybe you're feeling a little insecure. I'm not really going to touch on it any more than that, but it is true that Jennifer Lawrence and Chris Martin actually met through their involvement in Hunger Games 2 and did subsequently date for a little while. The other thing that happened between the first and the second film too was Silver Linings Playbook. So Silver Linings Playbook came out in late 2012 and Jennifer Lawrence won Best Actress for it. If she wasn't a star before, she was certainly a big star now. She'd been nominated for 2 Oscars and she'd won 1. So everything about the second film was set up to be a big success, and it absolutely was. The VFX are stunning. I think they used Weta, who did the same visual effects for Lord of the Rings, particularly for stuff like the water and fluid simulations. Honestly, mind-boggling. I honestly do think that The Hunger Games: Catching Fire is one of the best science fiction films in modern history. The story, the style, the acting, the dialogue, the writing, the visual effects, the score, it all just blends together so seamlessly, and it ends on a really strong, fierce note. This last shot going in on Katniss when she's realizing the detriment and the devastation that has just been caused by the Capitol and President Snow, and then through this expression, this fury, this sort of dark phoenix look coming into her eyes, and then it cuts to black. I love that. I love that. The film went on to be a huge critical and commercial success, grossing $865 million worldwide and earning a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. Again, critics praised the acting, the direction, and the overall expansion of the world, as well as the more sort of focused tone that this film has. It's a similar plot to the first one, but darker and more threatening and yet more fun. I think everything about this is kind of a perfect sequel. I have a little criteria that I use in my head for what makes a perfect sequel, and it involves things like, is the story better than the first one? Is the acting better? Is the story larger? Does it feel like it's expanding on the universe in an organic way without it feeling forced? It's an extremely well put together film and is honestly still a true favorite of mine. However, this was a high point for the series. So, let's talk about Mockingjay. So Catching Fire had a budget of $140 million and made $865. Mockingjay Part 1 had a budget of about the same and made $755. So it underperformed by about $110 million. Not great. Considering that the second film was such a success in every way, it made a ton of money, it made way more than the first one, it had a better critical reception than the first one, it had a better audience score than the first one, one would think that the third film would be something of a bankable hit. But I think as we're going to discover together as we continue to talk about franchises with mixed legacies, the third film in almost every franchise is always a risk. The first film in a franchise is the idea. It's the core components. It's also a little bit of the testing ground. It's allowed to be a little bit messy. The second film is where you solidify, is where you really, really hone in on what you're trying to tell, how you're trying to tell it, the tone, the approach. Where does it stand in the box office? Is it a popular franchise? Is it a bankable franchise? There's a lot to be said for Mockingjay Part 1, and really, I'm just going to put the word out there. I'm going to use it. I do think the thing this film is most guilty of is being boring. I can't remember who said it, but somebody once said the worst thing that a film can be guilty of being is boring. And this film, unfortunately, does suffer from tedium. I remember when Mockingjay Part 1 came out, I did not immediately flock to the theaters. People that I knew had gone and seen it, and they were disappointed. They did not like it compared to the first two. The consensus that I was getting from people was that it was slower, was that it was boring, it didn't have any Hunger Game in it, and it didn't feel like the other films. It didn't have a similar plot. It didn't have the same kind of narrative and tone. It was decidedly darker, but I don't think that really worked in the favor of Mockingjay Part 1. I like the tone of this film. I enjoy that it's decidedly grim. I do think maybe at times it's a little too grim, but it does lead us to some of the most stark and dramatic moments in the franchise. One that really sticks out in my brain for this film is the explosion of the dam. It's a really big moment in the book as well as the movie. It's not actually explicitly discussed or shown in the book. They give it its own scene in the movie, and it is honestly, it still gives me chills when I watch it. The combination of the editing as well as the score, it's a really beautiful piece of score. It's basically an adaptation and expansion of The Hanging Tree, which is the song that Katniss sings earlier in the film. I think it's probably the most impressive sequence in the film. There is also one fairly large action sequence in this film, and that is the fighter plane scenes. I think this scene is really cool with the way that it's shot. They shot in all these abandoned buildings in, I believe it was Berlin. The dilapidation does look very realistic, but setting alone isn't enough to make this scene super exciting. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's just something perfunctory about the action scenes in Mockingjay. There's something decidedly less enjoyable about them, and overall, that grim nature that we were talking about, I think it just sort of works against the film. Thinking about the last shot of Catching Fire, where we're closing in on this face and we're like, oh man, this woman's about to wreak havoc. Watch out, President Snow. And then in the next film, she's like shell-shocked in a bunker where all of the main action that happens in this film happens without her. And this is something that I find deeply frustrating to watch about this film. There's a lot of really interesting things that go down in this film, almost none of which actually involve Katniss. Katniss spends this entire film in the District 13 bunker. I do understand that she is suffering from some post-traumatic stress disorder here. I understand that she's going through a lot and she has a lot of trauma, but I find it harder as an audience member to connect with her in this one. Part of the disconnect here is because the books were written in first person and this is in third. So a lot is going on. I mean, it's clear even as an audience member that a lot is going on in Katniss's mind. What exactly is going on though? We as an audience member are not necessarily privy to, and that is a shame. This was not based off of great source material. I thought the first book was really good, I thought the second book was fantastic, and I thought the third book seemed thin and rushed. The second book is alluding to the entire idea of a revolution starting, and really I think that would work better if the third book was all about the beginning of the revolution, and then there was actually like a 4 or a 4 and a 5 that further developed this. No one overthrows a government in a night. Unless it's the Hunger Games franchise, in which I guess you can actually overthrow the government in an afternoon. You're telling me that you've built this system over 76 years and you can just revert it in a day? It's that fragile? It's that fragile. The film moves at an awfully slow pace. A lot of people were quite critical of this, especially with the fact that this is part 1 of a part 2. In reviewing this film, it's impossible not to talk about the fact that this film is more like half of a film. They took the final book, Mockingjay, and they split it in 2, and they made each of these 2 to 2.5 hour movies. So they took a book that is no larger or smaller than the first 2, and they split it into about 4.5, 5 hours of content. Even when I read the book, I thought, wow, the first half of this book is really slow and very little goes on, and it frustrates me that all the most important events happen while Katniss is essentially napping. And we are going to talk about Lionsgate's decision to split this and how that ultimately worked against them. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but we're going to come back to that in a big way. In the first 2, she was put into the games and there was nothing that she could do about it. In this one, she's being made to star in commercials and there's nothing that she can do about it. And it's just not really interesting. It's not really interesting to watch. It's really not what I wanted to see from this franchise. This film ends with a title song by Lorde called Yellow Flicker Beat. Now, this song is my favorite Hunger Games end track. In the first one, we had Arcade Fire, which was a good song. Second one, the Coldplay song, has sort of a mysterious kind of enigmatic air to it. In this one, though, the song by Lorde is like unleashed. Yellow Flicker Beat is really, really honed in and focused on Katniss as a character. I absolutely love the line in the song, "They used to shout my name, now they whisper it." That kind of gave me chills the first time I heard it. Lorde also curated the entire album, Mockingjay Part 1. She collaborated with some incredible artists. I mean, Churches, Tove Lo, Charlie XCX, Ariana Grande, Kanye West. That's not even the whole list, but honestly, if you've never heard the soundtrack to Mockingjay Part 1, you need to go out and get it. Mockingjay Part 2. The decidedly less epic conclusion to the series. Where are we? How did we get here? How did we fall so far? I'm not gonna lie. Everything about this film is disappointing to me as an audience member, as a lover of the books. Although, again, I wasn't a big lover of Mockingjay as a book. This film was made for a budget of around 160 million, so about 10 million more than the last one, and yet it grossed just under $660 million. So to put that into perspective, it earned $36 million less than the first movie.
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
Me neither. I can't think of many franchises where the final film made less than the first. It's not a good look. Now, I haven't talked about this, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but the love triangle between Katniss, Gale, and Peeta in this franchise is one of the most, tepid, lukewarm love triangles I have seen in a modern franchise. Katniss is not a particularly compelling love interest, and that's fine. Her goals at the end of the day are to survive and to protect her family. She doesn't need to have a romance. She doesn't need to have a love in her life. She just needs her sister and her mother and a roof over her head. The fact that the whole series keeps trying to push this will they or won't they thing, both with Gale and Peeta, is one of the dumbest things about this film. Also, if you really want to know my hot take on it, I think she should have ended up with Gale. She definitely really likes him, and they have a bit of a romantic nature to their friendship. She also was not friends with Peeta before the Hunger Games. All of her experiences with Gale come through organic means. They hunt together, they hang out together, their families spend time together. Her and Peeta, their relationship is born from blood, tragedy, and trauma. I understand that people can often bond over trauma, but the idea here of Katniss ultimately ending up with Peeta because they lived through the Hunger Games together, and then I guess also because he was successfully de-brainwashed, how he was deprogrammed, I don't know. If that really does happen, it's pretty off-screen. He's pretty programmed for the majority of this film. He is actively trying to kill her, even when other things are trying to kill all of them. These two end up married together. They have kids together. Finnick actually has a line when they enter the Capitol where he says, "Ooh, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 76 Hunger Games." The idea here is that as they're raiding District 1, the Capitol has set up booby traps everywhere. Obviously, that's a very easy parallel to make with the Hunger Games, but it's just not well executed here. We just don't get the level of cool and exciting, dark and dangerous, threatening, and weird activations and booby traps that we get in the first two. If you're going to develop a kind of mediocre book into a film where the previous films were also really well received, I do think if you're going to adapt it, you have a little bit of a responsibility to try and elevate the material. I definitely think that the writers, I'm so sorry, Danny Strong, I loved you in Buffy, but I didn't love your writing in Mockingjay. I just feel like they could have tried a little bit harder to expand on it. So in the end, President Snow calls everyone to the Capitol. He says to all of the citizens, come, you're going to come here. You won't be harmed. So Katniss et al. Decide to dress up in disguises, which, any Hollywood movie, a disguise just seems to be like a ball cap or a hood. So they roll up to the Capitol in hoods. Immediately a fight breaks out. Again, it's not particularly compelling or interesting to watch. It's very grim. Katniss sees her sister. Her sister is like a medic now, and she's trying to help the people out. And then just as the action is really building to a climax, an explosion happens and Katniss passes out. And as she is passing out, there's this kind of so-so CGI of her being on fire. This is definitely nitpicking, but the VFX of the fire just isn't good. It's a really tricky one to do, especially when you're putting on people's bodies. But basically what happens is she watches her sister get blown up. And then, she wakes up in the hospital, which, by the way, how many times does our girl here wake up in a hospital bed in this series? She spends about as much time passing out and waking up in beds in this movie as Ichabod does in Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, which is like 7 times. She wakes up and basically Haymitch tells her that, I guess the revolution is over and they won? Again, why did all the important stuff happen while Katniss was passed out? What is with this series' proclivity for all the most interesting things happening while the main character's asleep? I also want to say, as you can see in this poster, all of the promotional images for Mockingjay Part 2 have Katniss in this really beautiful red outfit. It's like a red version of the black one that she wore in Mockingjay, and it's great, and it doesn't exist. It's literally not in the film. And I don't even know if it's a real outfit they made. This film does not end with a title song by an artist. I have no idea why, but they did not hire any artists to do a song for this film. They also did not make a soundtrack. That is mad disappointing and definitely one of the biggest letdowns of Mockingjay Part 2. Hunger Games, Hunger Games 2, and Hunger Games 3 have awesome soundtracks. Honestly, get into it. Mockingjay Part 2 went on to receive mixed critical and commercial success. Mockingjay Part 2 has a 69% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think the critical consensus that Rotten Tomatoes wrote up is actually a little overly kind. It says, with the unflinchingly grim Mockingjay Part 2, The Hunger Games comes to an exciting, poignant, and overall satisfying conclusion. Okay, so I agree with the unflinchingly grim part. I actually think it works against the film. I don't think it's exciting. I do think it's poignant. I really disagree with the assertion that it's overall a satisfying conclusion. Nothing about it is really satisfying. So, that being said, how do we get to this point? How did a franchise that made so much with the first two films, made so much money overall, it is still the 27th highest grossing franchise of all time, but how did the last movie make less than any of them? Lionsgate essentially pointed to two scapegoats for the low performance of Mockingjay Part 2. They basically said it had to do with the November 2015 Paris attacks, as well as the release of Star Wars Episode 6, The Force Awakens. It's easy to understand why, as far as the European box office goes, they may have had a lower attendance because of these attacks. Lionsgate is basically also saying that the release of Force Awakens, which was the new beginning of a Star Wars franchise, and had slightly similar characters, even visually they look similar, but did it oversaturate the system? Possibly. However, when Lionsgate basically pointed to these two things, Deadline Hollywood came in hot refuting those two things. First of all, they noted the fact that Mockingjay Part 2 came out like a month before Force Awakens. We can't blame the success of Star Wars, which came out a month after Mockingjay, for why Mockingjay did so poorly. In terms of the Paris bombing, I do think there's a validity to that statement. When I first heard that, I certainly thought, well, of course it performed lower in Europe. But Deadline Hollywood also pointed out that it performed poorer in comparison to all the other movies in like every country, in every continent. As much as Lionsgate is trying to sort of place the blame on this and that and all these external factors that were out of their control, I disagree. I honestly think it comes down to one major factor, and it is the last thing that we have to talk about here, because I do think it's the thing that really put a nail in the coffin of the whole franchise. The last Hunger Games was split into two. This is a trend that was started by Harry Potter and then continued by franchises like Twilight. Because the entire series of Harry Potter relies on mystery and mysteries that need to be solved and a lot of loose plot threads that need to be concluded, it's quite involved. It makes sense that they dedicated a whole 5 hours to wrapping up a previous 6 films. Harry Potter is the only franchise that the Part 1, Part 2 split really worked for. In my opinion, the biggest reason that Mockingjay 1 and 2 didn't do well here is because they took a very thin, small story and they spread it out over way too much time. The third book, I think, is actually the smallest by a little bit. It also has significantly less going on, and it is one large, long, bloated mess. This is right around the point where people started to feel taken by the Hollywood studios. With Hunger Games, people really started to feel like they were paying full price for half of a ticket. And it's true, Mockingjay Part 1 does not have a good 3-act plot structure, and the second one doesn't either. This is the franchise that I think was pretty much single-handedly responsible for killing the trend of the Part 1, Part 2 split. Before Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2 both came out and it kind of turned out to be, a loss for them, the MCU had announced that Infinity War wasn't just going to be Infinity War, but it was actually going to be, do you remember this? It was going to be Infinity War Part 1 and Infinity War Part 2. Now, spoiler alert, that didn't happen. If you're asking yourselves why, the answer is this franchise. Going off of the success of the Harry Potter split and the minor success of the Twilight split, Infinity War decided to do the same thing. And they were going to brand these two movies as Infinity War Part 1 and Infinity War Part 2. They announced that, people were excited about it, and then Mockingjay Part 2 happened, and it didn't end well. Then all of a sudden the MCU announced that it wasn't going to be called Infinity War Part 1 and Infinity War Part 2, but rather it was going to be a third Avengers film, Infinity War, and a fourth Avengers film, which would eventually be titled Endgame. They did a really smart thing here, and looking at the dwindling success of the franchise split, decided to rebrand Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2. The Part 1, Part 2 split was not, as some people thought, a staple of the industry now. People thought that this might be the future of filmmaking, the same way that, like with the release of Avatar, some people thought 3D really was going to be the full stop future of filmmaking. They don't even make 3D TVs anymore, by the way. They don't make those. Hunger Games effectively proved that audience members are smarter than Hollywood was sometimes giving them credit for. Because whether you had read Mockingjay or not, if you went in and you saw Mockingjay Part 1, you could tell that they were spreading this thing out thin. You could tell that there wasn't a lot of plot to work with. You could tell that it wasn't as strong as the first book or the second. You could tell that the source material was not worthy of being 5 hours. Few things are. So again, in Lionsgate's perspective, they tried to say it had to do with the November 2015 Paris attacks, that it had to do with competitive franchises like Star Wars and James Bond. But really, I think it was their own darn fault because they got a little bit greedy. They took a franchise that was not inherently a smash hit, and they basically just let it overstay its welcome. So of course, the franchise kind of crashed and burned, and we'll never see another Hunger Games movie again. Obviously, that's not the case. That's not how Hollywood works. If you thought I was serious... So in 2019, it was announced in a kind of unprecedented move that Suzanne Collins was working on a prequel book to The Hunger Games titled The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. That's not unprecedented in its own, but what was that it was a simultaneous announcement of a forthcoming film adaptation too. Usually a book has to come out and be successful first, and then you make a movie about it. But Lionsgate already had an exclusive deal with Suzanne Collins that any future Hunger Games intellectual property she produced, Lionsgate would have the option to turn it into a movie. The book was released in May 2020, and reception was mixed. I myself have picked up the book, but I have not read it. I am going to read it. It is actually thicker than the other books. That kind of intrigues me. This book actually focuses on Snow when he was younger, and he was a victor of the Hunger Games, so it's about him being a mentor in the upcoming 10th Hunger Games. The book received mixed reviews, as did Mockingjay, and there's already a movie. I'm excited by the idea that Francis Lawrence is attached. He did direct 2, 3, and 4. He's a great director. He's done a lot of things I really love. So I think if anybody has the power to make it good, it's him. But at the same time, he could only do so much with Mockingjay. So what can we learn from a franchise like this? Well, first of all, we can learn that you can't milk your audiences without comeuppance. You also can't milk a larger audience out of a franchise that doesn't have a huge base to begin with. I know a lot of people who've seen one or some of the movies, and very few people who've actually read the books. I do think because of the dwindling success of the end of the franchise, Songbirds and Snakes is a risk. I actually think it's kind of like starting over again for them. Usually prequels bank on the success of previous entries, but as this one had a nosedive at the end, I think it's an absolute risk to make this. Also because it's not going to have any of the same actors, and it can't. The majority of audience members gave up with Mockingjay Part 1. A lot of people did not see Mockingjay Part 2. All 4 films are available on Netflix in Canada, or if you use an ExpressVPN. I did see all 4 in theaters, but what about you? I really want to know. How many Hunger Games films did you see? Did you stop after the first one? Did you see the whole thing through? Did you, like a lot of other people, give up after Part 1? And why? Please let me know in the comments below. I am super fascinated to know where people stopped with this series, because the consensus that I get is that most people I know have not seen all of them, which is a little sad because there's only 4. In the future, we're going to be talking about franchises that have as many as 13 to 15 entries, where it's way more likely that most people haven't seen all of them. So it's a little bit sad that such a large franchise with such a heavy hitter actor like Jennifer Lawrence just didn't really succeed at keeping people's attention enough for 4 entries. So that's it. That's the story. That is the mixed legacy of the Hunger Games franchise. Unfortunately, it's not the end of the Hunger Games franchise. There is more to come. When I get invested in something, I get invested. That's why I love doing this series, because even if the movies get worse, I stay invested. So I am going to read the book. I am going to go see the new movie. Maybe I'll report back on it here. If you also have any suggestions for franchises or TV series that I should cover, let me know. I've already got a good list of ones that I've got coming up. I'm going to be posting videos every week, and I'm going to be paying very close attention to people's suggestions. I want to bring forward recaps of franchises that you just couldn't be bothered to finish, okay? And let me know where you stopped watching with Hunger Games. Until then, I hope everybody has a really great week. I hope you have a very productive week. I hope you get some rest. I know I will be, and I will see you all next week. Bye. Coriolanus. So this one actually stars President Snore. Snore?